Racist neighbor calls police on black family. But the truth shocks everyone. It all started with a frantic 911 call from a concerned neighbor. "There's suspicious activity at the house next door," the woman told the operator, her voice dripping with urgency. "I don't know what's going on, but I need officers here immediately." Moments later, police cars pulled up to the quiet suburban neighborhood. The flashing lights broke the peaceful evening, and curious neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains. As the officers approached the home, they were prepared for the worst. But what they uncovered left everyone speechless. You won't believe the truth behind this shocking incident, and how it changed everything for the neighbor, the family, and the entire community. Where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. It was late evening, and the quiet suburban street was still. The sound of moving boxes and muffled voices echoed from a house at the end of the block. A black family was busy unpacking their belongings, their laughter and conversation filling the air as they worked together. The teenage boy carried a large box labeled "Books" into the house, his father following behind with another one. Across the street, a woman stood by her window peering through the blinds. Her sharp eyes tracked every movement. She muttered to herself, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What are they doing so late? This doesn't look right." She leaned closer, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The family had only moved in a week ago, excited to start fresh in what they hoped would be a welcoming community. The father, a respected surgeon, had taken a job at a nearby hospital, while the mother, a lawyer, had opened her own practice downtown. Their son was starting at the local high school and had spent his first few days trying to adjust to the new environment. Despite their excitement, they couldn't ignore the stares and whispered conversations from their new neighbors. The teenage boy had noticed it the most. Whether he was riding his bike or walking to the mailbox, he felt the weight of judgmental eyes following him. Inside the house, the mother wiped her hands on a towel as she unpacked dishes in the kitchen. "This place has potential," she said, her voice full of optimism. "It's going to be great for us." Her son nodded, but didn't say much. He loved his parents' positivity, but he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in his gut. At school, he had already heard whispers from classmates about how different his family was. And now, there was that woman across the street who never seemed to stop watching them. Meanwhile, the neighbor pulled back from the window and frowned. She muttered to herself again, "I don't like this. Something's off about them." Her hands tightened around her phone as she continued to pace. The street they lived on was picture-perfect. Neatly trimmed lawns, clean sidewalks, and rows of identical houses with freshly painted shutters. But behind its charm, there was a certain coldness that the family had felt since their first day. The neighbors were polite, but distant. Smiles didn't quite reach their eyes, and conversations were laced with subtle but unmistakable undertones. Earlier that week, during a morning jog, the father had encountered one of the neighbors. "You must be new here," the man had said, his tone overly friendly but tinged with curiosity. "We don't usually get folks like you around here." The father had smiled, keeping his tone polite. "We're looking forward to being part of the community," he had said. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the man's words carried a deeper meaning. Back at home, the teenage boy dragged another box into the house, his muscles aching, but his mind focused on finishing the job. His mother handed him a glass of water and smiled. "Almost done," she said. "You've been a huge help." He smiled back, though his eyes darted to the window. He saw the silhouette of the woman across the street and felt a chill run down his spine. She was always there, watching. The neighbor, still glued to her window, narrowed her eyes as she saw the boy carrying another box inside. "Nobody moves in this late," she muttered. This can't be normal. Finally, the neighbor picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was hurried and filled with suspicion. "I need to report some suspicious activity," she said. "There's a group of people moving things into the house across the street. I don't think they belong here." "What kind of activity?" the operator asked. "They're sneaking around in the dark, carrying things into the house. I've never seen them before, and they don't fit in here," she said firmly. The operator assured her that officers would be sent to investigate. The neighbor hung up, satisfied. She crossed her arms and returned to the window, muttering, "Finally, someone will handle this." The family was completely unaware of the call. They were almost done unpacking for the night, and had begun joking about what takeout to order for dinner. The teenage boy laughed as his father tried to convince them to order pizza for the third night in a row. Their laughter was interrupted by flashing red and blue lights outside. The boy froze, his heart racing. "Dad!" he called out, his voice tinged with fear. "The police are here." The father and mother exchanged a glance before walking to the front door. The father opened it, his calm demeanor masking the frustration building inside him. "Good evening, officers," he said. "Can I help you?" "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address," one officer said, his tone professional but cautious. "Suspicious activity," the father repeated, raising an eyebrow. "We're just moving into our home." The officer glanced past him into the house, where boxes were stacked neatly along the walls. The mother stepped forward, holding her son close. "This is our home," she said firmly. "We've been unpacking all evening." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what to do. Behind them, the neighbor stood on her porch, arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. "I told you something wasn't right," she called out. "You should check their papers or something." The father's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Feel free to check," he said, gesturing toward the house. "We have nothing to hide." The officers hesitated before stepping inside to verify the family's story. The teenage boy stood beside his mother, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He couldn't believe this was happening. The neighbor remained on her porch, watching intently. She truly believed she had done the right thing, that she was protecting the neighborhood. But as the officers began to uncover the truth, the smug look on her face began to falter. What she would soon learn would force her to confront her assumptions, and it would leave her and the entire neighborhood stunned. The police officers, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, stepped inside to verify the family's story. They asked for identification and proof of ownership, which the father provided without hesitation. As they checked the documents, more neighbors began to peek out from behind their curtains or step onto their porches, drawn by the calm. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars lit up the quiet street, casting long shadows on the manicured lawns. The teenage boy stood frozen by the doorway, his chest tightening as the officers stepped out of their cars. Behind them, the nosy neighbor stood on her porch, arms crossed, her face smug with self-righteousness. Inside the house, the father exchanged a glance with his wife, silently communicating the importance of staying calm. "I'll handle it," he said softly, before walking to the door and opening it. "Good evening, officers," the father greeted, his tone polite but steady. "How can I help you?" One of the officers stepped forward, his posture firm but not hostile. "We received a report about suspicious activity at this address," he said. "A neighbor called in, concerned that someone might be breaking in." The father's brows furrowed slightly, though his calm expression didn't waver. "Suspicious activity," he repeated. "We're just moving into our home." Behind him, the mother stepped forward, her tone equally calm but tinged with frustration. "We've been unpacking all evening. This is our house," she said, motioning toward the boxes stacked neatly in the living room. The officers exchanged glances, their body language suggesting hesitation. The father noticed this and gestured toward the house. "You're welcome to come inside and take a look," he offered. "We have nothing to hide." The teenage boy stood quietly next to his mother, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of the officer's gazes and the judgment radiating from the neighbor across the street. The woman had moved closer to the edge of her porch, her hands on her hips as she called out, "I told you something wasn't right. People don't move in at this time of night." The mother turned to her, her voice sharp but controlled. "We're moving into our home. That's not a crime." The neighbor scoffed, shaking her head. "People like you don't usually live here. How do we know you didn't just pick the lock and start hauling things in?" The boy's heart sank at her words, but he stayed silent. His father, however, stepped forward slightly, his voice firm but calm. "We're not going to engage in baseless accusations," he said, looking directly at the neighbor. "Officers, if you need to check anything, please go ahead. We have all the documentation to prove this is our home." The police officers, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, stepped inside to verify the family's story. They asked for identification and proof of ownership, which the father provided without hesitation. As they checked the documents, more neighbors began to peek out from behind their curtains or step onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. The family stayed composed, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Some of the bystanders whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. A few seemed sympathetic, but no one spoke up. One man leaned toward his wife and murmured, "This doesn't seem right. They're just a family moving in." His wife glanced at him nervously. "Let's not get involved," she whispered back. "It's probably nothing." Inside the house, the officers examined the documents carefully. One of them looked up and said, "Everything seems to check out." The father crossed his arms, his expression calm but firm. "Of course it does," he said. "This is our home." Before the officers could respond, the neighbor called out from the doorway. "What about the boy?" she demanded, pointing at the teenage son. "Did you check his ID? How do we know he's not just some random kid they brought in?" The boy flinched at her words, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. His mother placed a protective hand on his shoulder, her expression sharp. "He's our son," she said, her voice steady. "And you don't have the right to make those kinds of accusations." The neighbor shrugged, her expression unbothered. "I'm just saying, you can't be too careful these days." The father turned to face her fully, his posture tall and unyielding. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You didn't see anything suspicious. You saw a family moving into their home and decided we didn't belong. That's not protecting the neighborhood, that's prejudice." The neighbor opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her confidence wavering under the weight of his words. Turning back to the officers, the father gestured toward the neighbor. "She made this call based on assumptions, not facts," he said. "And my family had to endure this humiliation because of it." The officers nodded slightly, their earlier caution replaced with a sense of discomfort. "We apologize for the misunderstanding," one of them said. The father shook his head. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. This is what happens when people act on their biases instead of getting to know their neighbors." The boy, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, looked up at his father with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had always admired his father's strength, but seeing him handle the situation with such composure and dignity was something he would never forget. The mother, too, stood taller beside her husband, her expression unwavering. She turned to the neighbor, her voice steady but cutting. "You owe us an apology," she said. The neighbor hesitated, her eyes darting to the gathering of neighbors who were now watching her intently. For For the first time, she seemed to realize that she was no longer in control of the situation. As the officers finished their check and prepared to leave, the father stepped forward one last time, his gaze unwavering. "Go ahead," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Let's see what else you find when you check, because I guarantee you'll find nothing but a hard-working family who earned the right to be here." The screen fades to black, leaving the tension hanging in the air. The air was heavy with tension as the police officers finished checking the documents the family had provided. The father stood calmly by the doorway, watching their every move, his composed demeanor masking the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The mother stayed close to their teenage son, her protective instincts kicking in as she quietly reassured him with a hand on his shoulder. One of the officers stepped forward, handing the documents back to the father. "Everything checks out," he said. "This is your home." The father's lips pressed into a thin line. "I told you that from the beginning," he replied, his tone measured but firm. "What more do you need to see?" Before the officer could respond, the neighbor marched across the street, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This doesn't add up," she said loudly, glaring at the family. "You can't just take their word for it. Something is off here." The father turned to face her, his calm expression unwavering. "What exactly is off?" he asked, his voice steady. The neighbor hesitated for a moment before doubling down. "I saw them unloading things late at night." "Who does that?" "It's suspicious, and I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." The mother stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You're trying to keep the neighborhood safe from what?" she asked, her voice sharp. "From us." "Your neighbors." The neighbor scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but people like you don't usually move into neighborhoods like this." The teenage boy flinched at her words, his chest tightening. He looked up at his father, who remained calm and collected. The father took a slow step forward, his eyes locking onto the neighbors. "Let me tell you exactly who we are," he began, his voice low but powerful. "We are a family who worked hard to earn the right to live here. We moved in a week ago, hoping for a fresh start and a welcoming community. But instead of introducing yourself, instead of offering a warm welcome, you've chosen to see us as a threat." The neighbor opened her mouth to respond, but he didn't give her the chance. "You didn't see strangers," he continued. "You saw us, your neighbors, and decided we didn't belong. That has nothing to do with keeping the neighborhood safe and everything to do with your own bias." The neighbor's confidence began to falter. She glanced around, realizing that other neighbors were watching from their porches and windows. The judgmental looks she expected to be directed at the family were instead turned toward her. "That's not what this is about," she said defensively, her voice losing its edge. "I was just trying to look out for everyone." "No," the father said firmly, his tone unwavering. "You were trying to exclude us. You assumed the worst without taking a moment to ask who we are or why we're here." The teenage boy watched his father with awe, his admiration growing with every word. He had never seen someone stand up so calmly, yet powerfully, in the face of such blatant prejudice. One of the officers, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the neighbor, "there's no evidence of any wrongdoing here. The family has provided valid proof that this is their home." The neighbor looked flustered, her cheeks reddening as she fumbled for a response. "Well, I thought—" The father cut her off, his voice softening slightly but still carrying weight. "You thought you knew who we were, based on nothing but assumptions," he said. "And those assumptions could have led to something much worse tonight. Do you understand that?" The neighbor looked down, her earlier bravado completely gone. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. she said quietly. The father sighed, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. You may not have meant for this to happen, but it did. And my family had to endure this humiliation because of your actions. He turned to the officers, his gaze steady. And you, he said, addressing them directly. Is this what it's come to? Being guilty until proven innocent in your own home. The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their earlier professionalism giving way to visible regret. We're sorry for the inconvenience, one of them said. We were just responding to the call. The mother stepped forward, her voice sharp. You didn't just inconvenience us. You allowed someone's baseless accusations to disrupt our lives and make us feel unsafe in our own home. That's unacceptable. The tension in the air shifted as the truth began to unravel. One of the bystanders, a neighbor who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, stepped forward hesitantly. I'm sorry, she said softly, addressing the family. I should have spoken up sooner. This isn't right. The father nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing that more needed to be done. Turning back to the crowd, he spoke clearly and confidently. For those of you who don't know us, let me properly introduce my family, he said. I'm a surgeon, he continued. I've spent my entire career saving lives and helping people. My wife is a lawyer who fights for justice every day, and my son is an intelligent, kind young man who deserves to feel safe and valued in his own community. He paused, letting his words sink in. The neighbor who had called the police looked visibly stunned, her mouth slightly open as the weight of her assumptions hit her. The officers, now fully realizing the mistake they had made, nodded respectfully. We're truly sorry for the trouble tonight, one of them said. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. The father accepted their apology with a nod, but added, It's not just about what happened tonight. It's about creating a community where no one has to feel like they don't belong. The neighbor across the street looked at the family, her expression a mix of regret and shame. She opened her mouth to apologize, but hesitated, her words faltering. I didn't know, she said weakly. No, you didn't, the father said, his tone firm but not unkind. But now you do. And it's up to you to decide what you'll do with that knowledge. As the police packed up and the neighbors slowly began to disperse, the family stood together on their porch, the teenage boy looking up at his father with newfound respect. Dad, he said quietly, how do you stay so calm? The father smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Because losing your temper won't change people's minds, he said. But standing tall, speaking the truth, and showing strength through respect, that's how you make a difference. The boy nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. For the first time since they moved in, he felt a sense of pride and belonging. The police cars pulled away, their flashing lights disappearing into the night. The father stood on the porch, his arm resting on his son's shoulder. Around them, the neighbors lingered, unsure whether to stay or retreat into their homes. The nosy neighbor remained rooted to her spot, her earlier confidence now replaced with an expression of uncertainty and regret. The father's voice broke the silence, steady and calm, but laced with conviction. Before you all leave, he said, addressing the gathering neighbors, I think it's important we talk about what just happened. The crowd stilled, their curiosity holding them in place. The father turned his gaze to the neighbor who had made the call. You said you didn't know us, he began, so let me tell you more than just our names and professions. He stepped forward slightly, his posture composed. What you don't know is that I've been here before. Not in this exact neighborhood, but in situations just like this. Growing up, I was often made to feel like I didn't belong. People assumed I was up to no good simply because of how I looked or where I came from. I've had police called on me for walking through my own neighborhood. I've been followed in stores where I was shopping for groceries, not stealing. And those experiences didn't stop when I became a surgeon. They've followed me my whole life. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, some of them clearly uncomfortable with the truth he was sharing. The teenage boy looked up at his father, his eyes wide with admiration as he listened. And yet, the father continued, I refused to let those moments define me. Instead, I use them as fuel to create change. That's why I work with an organization dedicated to promoting racial equality and bridging community divides. We help communities like this one become more inclusive, so no one has to feel like they don't belong. The neighbor who had made the call looked stunned. Her defensiveness had vanished, replaced by visible shame. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. I didn't know, she muttered weakly. No, the father said gently but firmly, you didn't. And that's the problem. You didn't know us. And instead of reaching out or asking questions, you jumped to the worst possible conclusion. You called the police on a family that was simply moving into their home. His words hit her like a weight. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said. The father nodded slightly. I believe you, he said. But the truth is, it could have gone much further. Calls like the one you made have led to devastating outcomes for families like mine. And while we were fortunate tonight, not everyone is. He turned his attention to the rest of the neighbors. This isn't just about one phone call, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. It's about the assumptions we all make, the biases we don't realize we carry, and the way those biases affect the lives of others. This neighborhood could be a place where everyone feels welcome, where no one has to prove they belong. But that starts with each of us being willing to examine our own actions and beliefs. One neighbor, who had been watching silently from her porch, stepped forward. He's right, she said softly. I've been guilty of making assumptions, too. I'm sorry, I didn't speak up earlier. Her words seemed to ripple through the crowd. A few others nodded, murmuring agreements. The teenage boy looked around, surprised to see the shift in attitudes. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The father took a step closer to the neighbor who had made the call. I'm not here to shame you, he said gently. I'm here to ask you to do better. And not just for my family, but for everyone who comes into this neighborhood. The neighbor finally looked up, her eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I was wrong, and I can see that now. I shouldn't have made that call. The mother, who had been standing silently beside her husband, spoke up for the first time. An apology is a good start, she said, her tone firm but kind. But change requires action. What will you do to make sure this doesn't happen again? The neighbor nodded, her shame palpable. I'll do whatever it takes to be better, she said. The father took a deep breath, his voice softening. I'd like to host a community meeting, he said, addressing the crowd. A chance for us to come together, talk openly about these issues, and learn how we can support each other better. I'll even bring in resources from the organization I work with to help us get started. The crowd murmured in agreement. The neighbor who had apologized nodded earnestly. I'd like to attend, she said quietly. I want to understand and do better. The father smiled faintly. That's all I ask, he said. The teenage boy watched his father with a newfound sense of pride. He had always known his dad was strong and wise, but seeing him turn such a difficult moment into an opportunity for growth inspired him deeply. As the neighbors began to disperse, Some of them approached the family to apologize or introduce themselves properly. The boy noticed a few kind smiles and encouraging words, and for the first time since moving in, he felt a small but significant shift in the way they were being seen. Later that evening, as the family sat together in their living room, the boy turned to his father. "How do you stay so calm when people treat us like that?" he asked. The father smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because staying calm doesn't mean staying silent," he said. "When you speak with truth and conviction, you can change the way people think. It may not happen overnight, but every step forward matters." The boy nodded, his admiration for his father growing even stronger. He felt hopeful that their presence in the neighborhood could make a real difference, not just for them, but for anyone who might come after. The living room was quiet, the soft hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence. As the family sat together, the teenage boy looked up at his father, still thinking about the evening's events. "Do you think things will really change?" he asked, his voice laced with both hope and doubt. His father smiled gently, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said, "but tonight was a start. And sometimes that's all you need to make a difference." The next day, word of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had stayed silent during the confrontation began to reflect on their own actions, or lack of them. Some stopped by the family's home to apologize, while others promised to stand up against prejudice in the future. One neighbor, a woman who had watched from her porch the night before, knocked on the door. When the father opened it, she hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not stepping in last night," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't right, and I should have said something." The father nodded, his expression warm but serious. "Thank you," he said. "It's not easy to acknowledge that, but standing up for what's right starts with moments like these." Across the street, the neighbor who had called the police was grappling with her own regret. She had agreed to attend the community meeting the father was organizing, and had begun reflecting on the assumptions she had made. The meeting, held at the local community center, was packed with residents. The father stood at the front of the room, his calm but commanding presence drawing everyone's attention. He spoke about the importance of inclusivity, the dangers of unchecked biases, and how communities thrive when everyone feels they belong. "This isn't just about my family," he said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us, about creating a neighborhood where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. That starts with listening, learning, and being willing to change." The neighbor who had called the police sat near the back, her hands folded in her lap. She listened intently, her earlier defensiveness replaced by a quiet determination to do better. The meeting sparked something bigger than anyone had anticipated. Other neighborhoods heard about it and reached out to the father for guidance, wanting to hold similar discussions in their own communities. His organization provided resources and support, helping to create a ripple effect of understanding and inclusivity that extended far beyond their street. Back at home, the family began to notice subtle but meaningful changes. The neighbor who had called the police started making small efforts to connect. She waved from her porch when she saw the teenage boy heading to school, and she even stopped by one day to introduce herself properly. While it was clear she still had work to do, her actions showed a willingness to change. The teenage boy, who had once felt out of place in the neighborhood, began to feel more accepted. His classmates started inviting him to join their activities, and the whispers and stares that had once followed him started to fade. One evening, as the family sat together after dinner, the boy turned to his father. "Why do you think she's trying to be nice now?" he asked, referring to the neighbor. Because she's learning, the father said. It's not easy to confront your own biases, but when people are willing to try, it can lead to real change. The boy nodded, thinking about how different things felt now compared to when they first moved in. Do you think the neighborhood will ever feel like home? He asked. His father smiled, his voice filled with hope. It's already starting to, he said. The next week, the family received a letter from the police department, promising to review their protocols and provide additional training to ensure that incidents like this wouldn't happen again. It was a small but important step toward building trust and accountability. The mother, reading the letter aloud at the dinner table, looked up and said, "This is what progress looks like. Small steps that lead to bigger changes." The teenage boy smiled, feeling a newfound sense of pride in his family and his community. As the family sat together on the porch that evening, the father turned to his son. "Do you know what the best way to fight prejudice is?" he asked. The boy thought for a moment before shaking his head. "It's to show people the truth," the father said, "through strength, respect, and understanding. When you stay calm and stand tall, you help people see beyond their assumptions. That's how real change happens." The boy nodded, his father's words sinking in deeply. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, he felt a sense of belonging, not just in his community, but in his own skin. The family sat together, watching the sunset. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing, one step at a time, and they were ready to keep moving forward. The family sat together on the porch, the father's words still echoing in the teenage boy's mind. The best way to fight prejudice is to show people the truth, through strength, respect, and understanding. The boy smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of pride in his family and hope for the future. The sunset painted the sky with vibrant colors, a fitting symbol of the changes beginning to unfold in their neighborhood and beyond. But the father's message wasn't just for his son. It was for all of us. Judging someone without knowing their story hurts everyone. It's time to replace assumptions with understanding. Have you ever experienced or witnessed bias? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it and learn from your experiences. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Your support helps us continue to share these powerful messages with the world. Thank you for watching. Your story can inspire the world. See you in the next inspiring tale.